Hi again. We're in The Rise of Adventism by Edwin Scott Gaustad, the editor, and this section is by Ernest Sandin, who wrote The Roots of Fundamentalism. This section is on millennialism. If one turns from theological to sociological characteristics, however, the picture becomes clouded. Neither the British nor the American millenarians of the 19th century seem to fit the pattern delineated for earlier apocalyptic millenarians. They do not seem to have been people deprived of power, nor potential revolutionaries, nor, most significantly, threatened with destruction. Instead, they were often well-to-do, if not wealthy. Henry Drummond, for example, the grandson of an English aristocrat, inherited a vast estate and often sat in Parliament. Lewis Way, another prominent early 19th century British millenarian, inherited a fortune of £300,000. Eleazar Lord, a prominent American millenarian, who with his brother published a periodical entitled The Literary and Theological Journal, served at one time as the president of the Erie Railroad, while winning and losing several fortunes before the mid-century. Or one could look, for instance, at William Miller himself. He might not be described as wealthy, but he was certainly not a member of a revolutionary mob. William Miller was a respected leader of his local community in upstate New York, an officer during the War of 1812, not a disenfranchised, irresponsible man. The investigation of this apparent discrepancy may prove rewarding to the student of Jacksonian America. It may offer a way to resolve the interpretive knots that have always surrounded the millenarians. To be blunt about it, millenarians such as William Miller have often been described as cranks. The behavior of other millenarians, those at Munster in the 16th century, for instance, may have been extreme, but the judgment of historians about that behavior has always been adjusted to take into account the severe provocation and crisis conditions under which they were forced to live. Miller and other 19th century millenarians, however, appear neurotic because no such provocation or extremity lent justification to their predictions of the imminent return of Christ and the end of the world. Many historians have thus been unable to account for the teachings and for the success of the millenarian movement in the 19th century. They have fallen back on demagoguery on the part of the leaders and childlike simplicity on the part of the followers to explain the phenomenon of millenarianism. Adventist historians, particularly Nichol, struggled to prove that that picture of the Millerites was a libel. William Miller, in Nichol's work, was pictured as a responsible, even cautious preacher, and his converts documented as average, intelligent human beings. The interpretive difficulty has persisted, however, and it may in fact have become even more puzzling to the average student to account for millenarian behavior now that Adventist historians have so patiently and effectively undercut the misconception of the Millerites as raving fanatics. If the early Adventists were not unbalanced by religious fanaticism, then what factors can account for their apocalyptic theology? If they were not fanatics or cranks, were they hypocrites? Fortunately, during the past 2 decades, and this is written around 1970, historians have provided some new perspectives and insights on the early 19th century in both Britain and America. When the views of Adventist historians concerning the character of their movement are placed within the context of this more recent scholarship, most of the difficulties of interpretation seem to dissolve. Millenarians, rather than appearing to be cranks or hypocrites as they did in older historical work, fit into the history of their era far more comfortably. Millenarians, in fact, emphasized and exemplified a number of the themes which historians now argue characterized that time. The fact that millenarians were biblicists, for example, has long been recognized. Every millenarian gave unswerving testimony to his belief that the Bible was the work of God and the revelation of God. But this biblicism did not set the millenarian apart from other Christians in the early 19th century. When I began my research into the early 19th century roots of fundamentalism, I was surprised to find very few books in which the questions of biblical inspiration and infallibility were debated. The doctrines were often simply affirmed, but virtually no controversial literature covering these topics seemed to exist. At first I assumed that my search for such literature was unfruitful because I was looking in the wrong place, or because the books had been lost or stolen. But finally, I concluded that this subject was not debated because early 19th century Christians were not yet troubled by doubts about the authority of the Scripture. For millenarians and non-millenarians alike, Christian belief in both Britain and America was based upon the assumption of biblical inspiration and authority. Earlier 18th century disputes raised by controversialists such as Tom Paine had been resolved to the satisfaction of most believers, and the early 19th century was a peaceful period so far as biblical criticism was concerned. Second, the millenarians interpreted the Scripture literally, another well-known aspect of their practice. The literal interpretation of prophetic passages was the foundation stone of millenarian theology. Prophecies promising deliverance in the form of a king were accepted literally, even in Republican America, as were the chronological limits which the millenarians dug out of the same passages in Daniel or Revelation. Millenarians were unanimous, for example, in predicting that Christ's return would be inaugurated by his personal reappearance to reign for precisely 1,000 years. They rejected as incorrect and blasphemously derogatory of the authority of the Bible the notion that the prophecies of the Second Advent might be fulfilled symbolically in an extended period of peace and godly rule sometime in the future. This insistence upon a literal hermeneutic has not seemed justified to later scholars. It is true that earlier interpreters, following a tradition begun by Origen and Augustine, allegorized passages that were never meant to receive such interpretation. But it is equally true that the millenarians did as much violence to the intention of the biblical authors by insisting upon a woodenly literal interpretation, even in apocalyptic literature, one of whose characteristics was the use of consciously symbolic and mysteriously metaphorical vocabulary. Edmund Goss recalled in an autobiographical fragment how his devoutly millenarian parents had interpreted the prophetic scriptures. And this is a direct quote from Goss. When they read of seals broken and of vials poured forth, of the star which was called wormwood that fell from heaven, and of men whose hair was as the hair of women, and their teeth as the teeth of lions, they did not admit for a moment that these vivid mental pictures were of a poetic character, but they regarded them as positive statements in guarded language describing events which were to happen and could be recognized when they did happen. End of quote from Goss. The result was that although all millenarians agreed that prophecy must be literally interpreted, they seldom could agree what this meant in the explication of any particular passage. Bitter quarrels and paper wars abounded in the history of millenarianism, offering ample testimony to the functional inadequacy of their affirmation of literalism. Under the circumstances, it would appear logical to assume that the millenarians' dependence upon literalism would handicap the movement, but this does not appear to have been the case. The millenarian insistence upon a literal interpretation of the Scripture was perhaps their most effective recruiting argument. They argued, perhaps unfairly, but nevertheless effectively, that their literalistic methods of interpretation demonstrated their fidelity to the authority of the Bible, while those who, in opposing them, had recourse to allegorical or metaphorical interpretations were not taking the Bible seriously. That this kind of argument proved effective would indicate that literalism was as widely shared a characteristic as biblicism. Not only was faith in the authority of the Bible not yet undermined by higher criticism, it would also appear that respect for scientific discoveries and mathematical exactitude had been rather simplistically transferred to fields such as prophetic interpretation. The complicated timetable which William Miller compiled out of the obscure, almost Kabbalistic references in Daniel and Revelation proved an attraction rather than a stumbling block to 19th century Americans. The Newtonian God, the great watchmaker, was expected to express himself in numerical puzzles. Many Americans and Britons believed that the chronology of future events as well as the rotation of the heavenly bodies, might be unlocked by a formula. Sandine goes on in the next segment to trace the development of this type of thinking and the spread of this type of thinking even into non-Christian systems. This utopianism, this millenarianism went much further than conservative Christians had anticipated it would. I'll put in a link to a series we did from Merrill Tenney's book, Interpreting Revelation, the chapter where he talks about the various methods of interpreting Revelation chapter 20, the single reference we have in the Bible to a period of 1,000 years, albeit 6 times it is referenced in that one chapter. So how have Christians interpreted the millennium? Merrill Tenney.